And we used to use the framing of VUCA, for
Right.
volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And Joey, you and I have talked about that before. That was coined at the Army War College, where I still do guest lectures.
Hmm.
But we've realized that VUCA, in this time, VUCA is no longer VUCA enough
It's not
for what we're
lucrative
about
enough,
to
huh?
experience. So
Wow.
Jamet coined this term in 2018 for brittle, anxious, nonlinear, and incomprehensible. And there's a big difference between VUCA and Bonnie. Bonnie is much more global.
Okay.
VUCA was more US centric. It was developed by the Army War College in the late 1980s.
Hey, anybody besides me a little dizzy these days, just trying to make some sense out of all this chaos? Jeez. I mean, work is challenging enough under normal conditions, whatever they are, right? But the incessant spinning and twirling is making me a little crazy. What about you? And hey, I'm Dr. Joey, the guy coaching you to work positive to grow people and profits, right? If it's affecting me like this, I bet it's affecting you too. Dr. Bob Johansen has been on this podcast at least 3 times before. Go back and listen to them. I'm a fanboy. He is my go-to strategic thinker and futurist, especially when it comes to figuring out the best path forward. Bob's mission right now is to help people, leaders, and rising stars like you and me make sense out of all this chaos and what he calls a Banny world. Banny stands for brittle, anxious, nonlinear, incomprehensible. Pretty much describes where we are today in culture, right? AI seems to drive most of this chaos. Dr. Bob talks not about artificial intelligence, but augmented intelligence. So the question really becomes, how do you want to be augmented? It's important to explore how Gen AI will disrupt those top and rising star leaders. So today, let's focus on augmented leadership. Buckle up, work positive community. The game is on. Yeah, the game's on. Dr. Bob Johansen actually played basketball for the University of Illinois, and we don't know how the game's going to turn out, but when we're recording this, they're in the Final Four. Congratulations, Bob. I'm sure your legacy lives on, doesn't it?
Well, I wasn't a great player, but I had a good time there, and I realized that I wasn't good enough to be a pro. So fortunately, I got into graduate school.
So there were 2 paths before you, athlete or intellectual.
Right.
Yeah, the choice is made for you. But Bob, I bet if NIL had been a thing back then, you would have worked a little harder on being a better basketball player.
It's possible. It was such a different world then than it was. And I had a full scholarship at Illinois,
Mhm.
and I guess my high point was I got to play against Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and
Wow.
he was a senior or he was a junior, he was a sophomore when I was a senior. And I actually got 20 points, but he got 45. So, so I knew I needed another career.
Well, you were comparing yourself against an elite athlete right there.
That's for sure.
I mean, golly, I can close my eyes and still see that sky hook, right?
Me too.
How do you defend that? I'm
You
I'm
don't.
impressed. No, you don't. You just stay out of the way and hope he doesn't land on you. Uh,
That's right.
I would just tell the first half of that story. I scored 20 points against Kareem
Good
Abdul-Jabbar.
idea.
That's what
Yeah.
I would do. I would talk about his 45. He and Wilt Chamberlain were going to get theirs, right? They were going to have all the points in the world. Wow, you just offered up a phrase that pays. The world was so different then.
Mm,
That's where you spent your career, Bob. And thanks, by the way, for being here for the fourth time. I always learn so much from you, and the Work Positive community is so much better.
thank
Um,
you.
the world is so different today. Not only from when you were playing basketball, but newsflash, the world is so different than it was last month.
Mm.
The pace of change, the chaos is just dizzying. One of your books, recent books, is Navigating the Age of Chaos. That's a very hopeful title to some of us, Bob, because some of us are just trying to keep our heads above water in the midst of the
Right.
chaos, but you're talking about navigating it. You have a unique acronym to describe the world, and I pronounced it wrong in the intro for this. So it's Bonnie, as in
Mhm.
my Bonnie lies over the ocean, because we're trying to navigate the age of chaos, right? Bani. Tell us where that came from, what it stands for?
Sure. So it was coined by our colleague at the Institute, Jamé Cascio. And Jamé and I wrote the book with Angela Williams, who has been the CEO of United Way Worldwide. So Jamé offered the original framing. I've brought with Jamé a kind of Bonnie positive, how do you flip it positive, and
Mm,
emphasized how leaders can learn from it and
mm,
also how we can cope individually with it. Angela has brought more the on the ground experience, but the whole notion of framing the future is one that we struggle with a lot at the Institute. We're the longest running futures research group in the world now.
mm,
And we used to use the framing of VUCA, for
right.
volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And
Mhm.
Joey, you and I have talked about that before.
Yeah.
That was coined at the Army War College, where I still do guest lectures.
Hmm.
But we've realized that VUCA in this time, VUCA is no longer VUCA enough
It's not
for what we're
Vucarish
about
enough,
to
huh?
experience. So
Wow.
Jamé coined this term in 2018 for brittle, anxious, nonlinear, and incomprehensible. And there's a big difference between VUCA and Bonnie. Bonnie is much more global.
Okay.
VUCA was more US centric. It was developed by the Army War College in the
Hmm.
late 1980s. So it's kind of post Cold War period.
Hmm.
Bonnie's very global. It resonates with people all around the world. And with Bonnie, there is an assumption that we may not be able to understand at all what's going on. Where
Hmm.
with VUCA, there was kind of an assumption that if only we find the right expert, if only we find the
Yeah.
right data, we'd be
Mm.
able to know what's going on.
Hmm.
But with Bonnie, it's different because there's things now that are just mysterious. They just don't make sense. And
Mm.
yet we have to decide anyway.
Mm. And hence the I in Bonnie, incomprehensible. And I got to tell you, out of
Right.
that acronym, that's the one that bothers me the most because
Well, it
we're,
should. That's the most
oh,
complicated.
good.
That's the most complicated. But it's interesting as we present the book globally, and I should say it's really interesting. The book has sold really well. It's sold more outside the US than it has inside the US. And as we present the Bonnie concept globally, the letter that pops out for almost everybody at first is anxious
Hmm.
because everybody's anxious,
Yeah.
particularly kids,
Yeah.
particularly young people.
Gen Z is showing the highest level of anxiety
Yeah,
we've seen in any generation.
yeah,
And their mental health needs
yeah,
are greater. They're leaving jobs left and right, literally,
right,
because of anxiety
right.
and their anxiety. What is the number now? Is it about 42, 43% of Gen Z say they're anxious at work?
Well,
Um,
and the expectations aren't good, particularly for young boys and men.
mm,
The expectation of a happy life is just quite low right now. So there's been a
mm,
kind of loss of faith in the future.
And so anxiety is over what's coming next.
Yes.
Um,
Yes,
okay.
and feeling, what's my role? And unfortunately, social media has kind of amplified that negative, and this is where I've actually changed my opinion. I've been studying social media since before it was called that, and I
Mhm.
used to be very optimistic about the impact of social media to bring people together, but I'm much more cautious about it now. The data has really flipped that it really does amplify the anxiety, it
Mm.
amplifies the anger, it amplifies the polarization.
Mm. Wow. The Anxious Generation is a book that is has influenced me, giving
Yeah.
copies to my
Yeah. So
daughter and
Jonathan Haidt,
son-in-law.
yeah, that's the
Uh-huh.
best summary book
Hmm.
is his book on it. But there's quite a literature on it now.
Hmm.
And the data is pretty convincing and
Very
it's
convincing.
caused me to change my mind actually, because I
Hmm.
used to be more on the positive side in terms of the impact of social media. Now I've clearly shifted to more on the negative side.
Hmm. Mm. And it's because of that rise in anxiety that you've shifted.
Yes, yes, and um, the distributed nature of social media has not evolved the way I had hoped. I hoped that there's an argument in Silicon Valley that anything that can be distributed will be distributed, and
Okay.
that distributed media will kind of democratize, will kind of make connectivity in the community sense easier.
Mm,
And some of that's happened, but big companies have come in and now kind of dominated social media.
mhm,
So the race isn't over yet. There still are forces around distributed media, but they're more centralized than I expected them to be. They're more controlling.
mm,
Um, Advertising continues to play a dominant role, and generally not a healthy one. The advertising industry, I thought, would kind of humanize their approach to this by now, and they've been very slow in doing that.
mhm.
And then the polarization. These media are really attracted by negativity. So
Yes.
they're attracted by anger. They're attracted by things that make us anxious. So
Mm,
it's a very tricky time that way. And I certainly haven't given up, and I'm not anti-tech, but it is really a concern. And that whole notion of anxiety that feeds into everything else around brittle and nonlinear and incomprehensible. If
mm,
you're anxious, anxiety is future oriented, depression is past oriented.
mhm.
So anxiety, as long as you have that anxious attitude toward the future, you just don't have that sense of hope that is so important, I think, to creating a
Mhm.
positive future.
Yes, and Bob, when we lose hope.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. And kind of my summary line about kids is I'm really optimistic about kids nowadays if they have hope.
Yes, yes. That may be the greatest gift we can give, particularly to Gen Z in our work cultures today, is
Yeah.
hope. So let's tease that out a little bit and talk about how that hope can take on legs and life and really walk through a company's work culture.
Hmm.
One of the things that I'm hearing, and I want to fact check this with you, but I want you to augment this notion too, is that when I can first belong and then become in a work culture, then I have some hope. So
Hmm.
belonging being those, well, of course, Gallup's, I
Yeah.
think they refer to it as Q12, that most important question, at least as
Right.
it rises to most people's minds, is do you have a best friend at work?
Mm.
And so that's that belonging question. But the
Yes.
becoming aspect is that where am I going to develop so that my personal mission or my personal purpose and aligns with the corporate or the company purpose, and where is the alignment there? And how do I advance in my what we've called career for so long? But actually now it's all about personal development. It
Yes.
looks like those two places, belonging and becoming, are real sweet spots where we can infuse hope for Gen Z who is so anxious today because of the loss of hope.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. And it also links to a sense of meaning and a sense of purpose. So
Hmm.
I think those organizations that have a sense of meaning, have a sense of purpose, what we call a clarity story. If you
Right,
can
right.
if you can tell a clarity story,
Mm,
then there's lots of flexibility. And you're right, it's no longer a career path in a linear way. It's more of a journey, which has
mm.
many different side roads that you
Yeah.
can take or not take. And it isn't necessarily within the same company, but it can be within the same clarity story. And I think those clarity stories become really important instead of just getting kind of bounced around. But it's a very difficult time, I think, to find that path of meaning, that path of purpose, that path of belonging. I think you're right. It does begin with belonging, but what is it that we have in common?
Mm, and how do we create some synergy around that
Yes,
commonality? And therein lies our meaning and purpose as it arises, right? And so,
that's right. And it's interesting in Silicon Valley, where I've spent most of my life and most of my career. I went to Silicon Valley in 1973 before it was called that. And in the early days, as the big companies moved in and grew, um, the definition of loyalty was more loyalty to your network
Mm,
than it was loyalty to the company. So it really had it's kind of whose network were you in, and some of the key developers, Doug Engelbart, the guy who invented the mouse and
mm,
Windows, and kind of all out of the core technology. The people who were in Doug's network, who spread out, that was a very powerful diaspora. The early Apple people were a
mm,
very strong diaspora. The big company corporate loyalty has never been very high in Silicon Valley, but loyalty to your network and to the communities that develop around the network were really high. Now, what's shifted is that I used to say that Silicon Valley, the reason it works is it's the mix and the mashing of the culture of changing the world changers, the Engelbarts of the world,
mhm,
and the people who were just extremely greedy, who wanted to make a lot of money.
mm,
And I'm not being critical of them. I actually think that greed, combined with the change of the world, is what made the creativity so strong. And it's always
mm.
been very international. It's really not a American phenomenon.
Right.
There's people from all around the world.
Mhm,
But now the greed and the more narrow frames on changing the world have become much more powerful than they were before.
mm, mm. So who's winning between those two poles?
Well, the greed is winning right now. Yeah, that
Mhm,
it's a greedy environment. It's a
mhm.
very opportunistic, a very polarized, a very sometimes angry environment. I mean, the word empathy is controversial in Silicon Valley now, and who would have thought that? I mean, how can you argue with empathy?
Oh, now we need to get Josh Friedman on here with us, right? Talk about EQ and the importance of empathy. And empathy, to your point, is that place where belonging and
Yeah,
becoming
it is.
receive validation, and so the
It
hope
is.
comes, right? So, man,
It
we're
is, and arrogance is a strange thing. Silicon Valley has always had a kind of arrogance, and often that's been a good thing to do these outrageous things,
oh
these
yeah,
amazing
yeah,
things that have happened.
unbridled confidence, right?
Yeah, but if the arrogance, takes on a kind of a weaponized
Mm,
arrogance,
mm,
it just becomes very threatening for not only for people but for ideas, and ideas like community, for example. My
mm,
favorite definition of government is, what do we choose to do together? What do
mm.
we choose to do together? And the answer in today's political environment is not very much. We
No,
because we don't
no,
trust each other. The
no.
Edelman Trust Index came out last summer, and their
Mhm.
summary globally about trust was the crisis of grievance, that everybody's kind of angry at everybody else. And if you go back to Robert Putnam's categories of
Mhm.
how do we derive meaning, he talks about how there's bonding social capital, which is kind of your in-group bonding, usually
Mhm.
against somebody else, as
Mhm.
compared to bridging social capital. Um, and in Silicon Valley now, there's more bonding social capital than
Yeah.
there is bridging social capital. I think that's going to shift in the long run, but right now it's a kind of a dire, threatening mood. Mm.
It is, and having such a formative effect on the bonding culture that we
Yeah,
see
yeah.
within companies and between companies today. So the anxiety, I think we can position, or we have positioned hope and belonging and becoming is helping us respond to that almost in like an antidote. What about brittle? If I can go back to the beginning, what about brittle? What
So
describe that
brittle,
for us, and what's the antidote for that?
yeah. So the antidote is bendable. If you're brittle, you want to be bendable, but
Mm,
it's got to be bendable within your own clarity story. And
mm,
brittle systems, the disturbing thing is brittle systems look strong, many of them, but they
mm,
aren't as strong as they look. So, for example, in the United States, we have bridges that actually look quite strong, but the infrastructure is not strong at all. So, what was it, 2 years ago when the Francis Scott Key Bridge across Baltimore Harbor was
Right.
rammed by the cargo ship Dolly? It
Yep.
looked strong, but it didn't just break, it shattered. It
Right.
shattered
That was
because it was
shocking.
brittle.
Hmm.
And it turns out it's not just physical things and physical infrastructure. It could also be concepts. In the healthcare system, um, there's a lot of brittleness.
Mm-hmm.
Even democracy may not be as strong as it looks. It may be more brittle than it seems.
Hmm.
So I think the notion of brittle is you have to be very careful of assessing which systems have the flex to bend in a increasingly chaotic world and which are likely to break because these brittle systems they don't tend to fail gracefully at the edge of their expertise. They tend to shatter, to
They crash
collapse.
and
And
burn, don't they?
it's
Yeah. Well,
it's
you're.
it's so interesting when we hire people at the institute.
Mhm.
We're always looking for people that fail gracefully at the edge of their knowledge because
Mhm.
with the future, we're all at the edge of our knowledge. So
Sure.
even though we're trying to hire PhDs and very deep thinking, very smart people, we want somebody who fails gracefully. And when you don't know what you're talking about as a futurist, pretending to know what you're talking about is really dangerous. So we don't want that.
It's
But
lethal.
we want people who know what to do. And if you don't know what you're talking about, what you can do is ask questions, or you
Mhm.
can bring in models and you can engage with people. But you can have clarity. You can't have certainty. So
Mhm.
I started my career. I had a famous consultant tell me when you're trying to hire somebody, um, take them out to lunch, and if they salt their food before they
Right.
eat it, you don't hire them,
That's it.
because they're
Yeah.
prejudging. For
Right.
me, the equivalent now is if they use the word absolutely twice during the lunch, I don't hire them, because there's just very little to be absolute about
Oh,
in
if anything
a Bonnie
anymore.
future.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's the old J.C. Penney test, isn't it? Where you salt your food before.
Oh,
Uh,
is it? I didn't hear
yeah.
it that way.
Yeah. That's a fascinating thing. Well, it's you're reminding me of a story I heard a long time ago about how Stradivarius violins are made. And they would go up to the top of the mountain and find the trees that had withstood the winds, right?
Oh, nice.
And had bent the most in the
Nice.
wind
Oh, that's a great
because
story.
they captured strength
Nice.
and a tone that the trees
Nice.
in the valley because they had not been tested
Nice.
beyond their normal endurance. So
Nice.
that brittleness of culture today is something we're all living. So hearing you say bendable, it, that's that's salve to many of our wounds, I think, today, to those of us who are people leaders, because we're having to be bendable or just get out. I mean, you and I
Yeah.
both know small business owners who are selling their businesses for pennies on the dollar now just
Yeah.
because they're so exasperated with trying to figure out, Gen Z seems brittle to them, and they came from a strong background of command and control. And I guess we're talking about guys our age primarily, and they just don't want to put up with the bendable
Hmm.
versus breakable. So,
Yeah.
but those of us who are intentionally creating work positive cultures today, we do understand the importance of bendable. So the A is for anxious. We've talked about that, the high levels of anxiety, the need for hope. What is the N for? Nonlinear?
Nonlinear. Yeah. And what it means is we can no longer assume cause and effect the way that we used to, kind of a linear chain of logic for
Mm,
decision making. And in the climate change area, scientists talk about hysteresis, where even if you do the right thing, you may not see the impact for years and years.
oh yeah, if ever.
And it's a disruption of our expectations about cause and effect.
Mm,
Now, the saving grace here, is you can teach your brain new tricks, and modern neuroscience
Yay.
has taught us that we can keep learning as we get older.
Neuroplasticity, right?
We don't have to stall, and there's ways of doing that. And we have these methods of improv that come from theater, theatrical improv, comedy improv. We work with Second City, the group in Chicago that feeds Saturday Night Live. They've got a corporate improv group. I'm on a podcast. We can put that in the show notes if you want. I was just on
Okay.
a podcast with Kelly Leonard, their lead for corporate improv. Most of the groups we work with now, and I work mostly with very senior groups at very big companies, most of them are working with us for strategic foresight,
Mm.
and they're taking improv training, which is
Wow.
really interesting.
That
That
is. I love it.
and improv has been around a long time.
Hmm.
There's also international relations improv, like the Harvard people that do the yes and methodologies, and the techniques are there. It's just this goes back to the Bonnie future. A lot of what we see in Bonnie doesn't make sense, but we have to decide anyway.
Mm.
That's improv. That's improv.
Hmm. That's yes, and we had
Yeah,
Joel Zeff
mhm,
on the podcast, and
mhm,
Joel works in that space and talks
yeah,
all over the place, and
yeah,
basically brings that improv method, yes,
right,
and to it. So rather than saying yes, but and
right.
defending our turf because we're thinking in a linear fashion, if I input A, I get B. We now see yes, and I might go
Right,
from A to M to Z to L to
right.
Q. So it is a nonlinear world today. What does that look like, yes, and in a work culture?
Well, I think that's easier to package and train than others, because there's lots of good improv teachers around,
Mm-hmm.
coming from different traditions. It's improv is kind of it makes you self-conscious, and it's there's a kind of weirdness factor to it, but it does once you it's really linked to simulation and gaming, and trying out things in a low risk way. um, and the military does a lot of it. They call it wargaming.
Yeah.
But there's an improv element to it that's built into the scenarios. And, I got to visit the National Training Center in the Mojave Desert for the Army National Training Center. And what the designers there told me is that they design simulated warfare to be harder than real warfare.
Mm,
And you're able to be virtually killed and then do an after action review
mm-hmm.
without having to die.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a really powerful way of learning. But
Mm-hmm.
a lot of it is improv. You're not there's the old military line is that plans work great until you get into battle, and then the plans get thrown out.
Mm-hmm.
That's improv. Again, it's just if you expect to have to improv,
Mm-hmm.
you're much more ready. That's a better framing for
Yeah.
what we're about to experience than if you expect a kind of linear career path.
Mm-hmm.
You want to expect to be surprised and be confident in your ability to respond anyway.
Mm-hmm. And we revert back to our training, right, to use a military designation,
You do.
but we don't know what aspect of our training will need to be front and center.
That's right.
We go yes
That's
and yes and yes and. That's a
That's right.
great
And you
way of
just have to be comfortable with that. When I first came to the Institute for the Future, I was working with Jacques Vallée, the kind of famous astronomer that studies UFOs and other sort of exotic things. And Jacques and I were on tour around to all the ARPA sites before the internet.
uh,
And we had slide trays because they were physical slides in those
uh,
days, Kodak carousels.
uh,
Um, and what he did, because we were given the same talk at each site, is he would change the order of the slides, and I wouldn't know what the order was. And the challenge was to give an involved talk without knowing what the order is, and that was really great training for me to get used. I'm not surprised when I give a talk now. I've kind of expect things to go wrong, and it's all about my ability to improv my way out of it.
I love it. I love it. Doc, let me ask you a question. What if the key to growing your work culture hides in plain sight? Take the free Work Positive Culture Assessment to discover it. Get insights in less than 4 minutes that transform your culture so you grow people and profits. You just answer 13 simple questions and discover your culture stage, strengths, and personalized next steps. Get your free aha culture moment at workpositive.today. Go to workpositive.today right now. Dr. Bob Johansen is my guest on this episode of the Work Positive Podcast. This book we're talking about, Navigating the Age of Chaos, there's a link to it on Amazon in the show notes. So be sure to click that and head over there. And also Bob's URL for his LinkedIn profile is in the show notes as well. So you can reach out to him there. So one more thing about this whole nonlinear piece. I recently had a really good conversation with a dear friend of mine who is far more of a musician than I am, but she's classically trained, and so and her voice is her primary instrument. So she's used to memorizing a piece of music and every breath and note and everything in it in a classically trained manner. And she'd recently gone to a Brandon Marsalis jazz concert. And she really did not like that because it just seemed not to have the kind of structure and meaning and the sorts of things that she looks for in music. I grew up about 30 minutes away from Thelonious Monk's home place.
Wow.
And so that was a very vibrant jazz culture there. And I was
Yeah.
taken as a kid over there at least once a
Wow.
year to listen to those types of musicians playing in that neck of the woods. So to me, when you talk about jazz, you're talking about improv
Yeah.
and riffing on those
Definitely.
things. So to me, that's what was running through my head was that conversation when we talk about
Yeah.
the way we approach this nonlinear world today has to be from a yes and,
Mhm.
which to me takes on an even better
Yes.
metaphor with music, right?
It does. It does. And I'm not an active musician, but I really listen to music a lot
Yeah, me
and
too.
played a little.
Uh,
But I think the thing about jazz is there are structures within which you improvise. There's
mhm.
progressions. There's
Right,
kind
right.
of again structures that you improvise within. I think that's the model too. When um,
Mhm.
we're thinking a lot nowadays about generative AI, and a
Mhm.
lot of people are calling for guardrails. I think it's too early for guardrails, but I don't think it's too early for what we call bounce ropes. So if you think about a wrestling ring,
Mhm.
um, there's ropes there that keep
Mhm.
the wrestlers or the boxers in the ring and keep them
Mhm.
safe. But there's
Mhm.
also four stanchions in the
Mhm.
corners. So you can afford a small number of guardrails, but they have to be very carefully chosen.
Yeah.
And because we don't yet understand AI, we don't even have a good language to talk about it.
Uh,
The dangerous people are those who say they understand it. It's not, nobody understands it
I
yet.
know. They'll lie
Um,
to you about other things too,
so
won't they,
you
Bob?
don't want to have politicians in particular or trying to establish guardrails for something you don't
Absolutely.
understand. But what you
Uh,
want is a few stanchions that are really critical, and then you want bounce ropes as
mm,
we learn what these technologies are. And again, I'm a humble futurist, so I'm focused 10 years ahead. I don't really
right.
talk about politics, but I think it's important
Mm,
that we not let these um, very exotic now new technologies fall into ways of limiting them that are really old fashioned based on old
mm,
technologies.
and no longer applicable to
Well, they
generative
may
AI.
not be. The
Yeah.
challenge is some of them may be applicable and some of them
Mhm.
may not. And you
Mm,
said earlier about how fast things are changing. That's
mhm.
true in a way that things
Mhm.
are changing fast, but other things are changing very slowly.
Mm.
Even with AI, the term artificial intelligence, that was coined in 1956.
That blows me
56.
away
So
every
it's
time you
taken
tell me
that long to
that.
be an overnight success. It's not new. What is new is things like large language models and
Yeah.
the way we're using them. Yes, that's new. And there's things within that are changing very fast. But there's a lot of other things that are not changing fast. And one
Mm.
of the tricky things for futurists is trying to figure out not only what is changing, but what's not changing.
Ah, by contrast, yeah,
Yeah.
because it gets washed out in what's changing so rapidly. Let's spend a couple of minutes, and we're about out of time, but of course, I could talk to you forever about these things. Let's talk for a moment about that I, the incomprehensible part,
Hmm.
because that's the side of it that causes me the most heartburn
Yeah.
because it is incomprehensible. So if it's incomprehensible, how do I shape a
Yes.
culture in my company around incomprehensibility? So one of the things that you did, and you've written another book, the third edition of Leaders Make the Future, and I love the subtitle, 10 New Skills to Humanize Leadership with Generative AI.
Yeah.
So that sounds like a paradox, at least, maybe an oxymoron to some people,
It
right?
is.
Because you're
Yeah.
talking about humanizing generative AI. That may be a
Right.
point of incomprehensibility for so many of us
Yeah.
who are trying to lead cultures today and lead people.
Yes.
Talk for a little bit about, give us some keys around humanizing generative AI, which seems to be so incomprehensible to most of us.
Right. And it is. I think that's the beginning point now is that we don't really have a good language to describe these large language models, what's referred to as generative AI, because it's actually
Mhm.
generating
Yeah.
um, new things from old things,
Right, right.
sorted in different ways. The term artificial intelligence is the worst term to
Mm,
describe an emerging technology I've ever
absolutely.
studied. It's
Mm.
just a really bad term. It kind of provokes, it's a bad framing, where Bonnie's a good framing,
Mm-hmm.
AI is a
Mm-hmm.
bad framing.
Yeah.
So we don't yet have language. I like generative AI better, but
Mm-hmm.
it's still not great. And even the developers who we've talked to with a lot, they don't know exactly what's happening in these large language models. So we're dealing with a tech that's part understood and part alchemy. It's kind of magic.
Mm-hmm.
And it's quite profound. So I spent most of my career studying the internet. I was kind of there when it was first getting going. I was actually at the conference in 1972 where it was first publicly introduced, and I was one of the first social scientists to study it. I think this whole thing around generative AI is even more profound because
Mm-hmm.
it's not just connecting us, it's playing with our brains. and
Yes.
and the quote that I'll leave you with on my answer to this question is from Tom Malone at MIT, where he said the big story here is not computers replacing people, although there will be some of that.
Mm-hmm.
There were layoffs in Silicon Valley this week that were explained by that.
Right.
Um, I'm I'm a little hesitant about that. But anyway, that's an aside. But it's the big story is not computers replacing people. It's
Mm.
humans and computers doing things together that have never been done before.
Yes.
Never been done before. So that whole notion, we're all going to be augmented. We just don't know how. And if you're a leader now, or if you're even curious, you got to be experimenting with this stuff. I've got
Mm-hmm.
my own customized version of ChatGPT that I've nicknamed Stretch because I'm
Mm-hmm.
only using it to stretch my thinking. But
Right.
I've used it for my last three books, and I'm
Uh-huh.
using it every day now.
Yep.
So we all have to do something to augment ourselves, but the something is not at all obvious. We have to
Mm-hmm. It's
experiment with
incomprehensible.
it.
Mm-hmm.
And in the way I use it, I have long conversations, but I don't trust it. I don't trust it. So I don't use it at the end of my writing of a book. I use it at the beginning
The front
to
door,
stretch
right.
my thinking.
Mm-hmm. Mm. So humanizing generative AI means that you and I create cultures in which we choose how to be augmented ourselves.
Correct, correct. And the real question, it kind of boils down to what
Uh-huh.
can humans do best?
Yes.
and what do we want to keep for ourselves, and
Uh-huh.
what can computers do best,
Uh-huh.
and then what do we want to do together.
And that's where I get really optimistic
Yeah,
about
me
creating
too.
work cultures today.
Yep.
Because if we can take the routine and mundane, or even things that are higher level thinking, I mean, we don't know where LLMs are going to go, but I'm a Claude devotee, and so I find Claude really stretching me, as
Hmm.
opposed to brain rot, which seems to be the buzzword
Yep.
today, right, from people using AI. But augmenting, and so constantly pushing back and growing my brain around that. I'm choosing how I'm augmented. So in
Right.
our cultures as leaders of people, rather than the fear that seems to come around in the negative side of the Bonnie world, we can discover the comprehensibility, which maybe we can't get our brains wrapped around totally, but
Right.
how can we humanize generative AI and choose to be
Yes.
augmented? Make those choices wisely that certainly fulfill my personal mission as well as the company's sustainability mission.
Yep.
And then it all gets to be humanized.
I think that's right. And kind of the first stage is to have generative AI do things we don't want to do, the more routine things.
Yeah.
But that's not the big story in the long run. If you
No.
look 10 years out, we're going to have more continuing conversations. That's when these things really come to life. And I mean, by continuing, I mean going on for hours. I mean, going on for hours. And that's going to help us develop meaning, develop ideas. And that's really stretching. I keep coming back to the word stretch. This is a really good name for this stuff. These things
Yeah.
are really good at stretching our minds, but
Uh,
only if we learn how to have those mind stretching conversations. This is not a question and answer jukebox.
no,
You know,
no,
this is not Google on steroids. This
no.
is a different thing. It's a
Yeah.
medium. Mm.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And by the way, just to reveal my age even a little more, every time you say stretch, I think of Stretch Armstrong, which was a toy when I was a kid.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
love it. Dr. Bob Johansen is my guest on this episode of the Work Positive Podcast. So we've got your LinkedIn URL in the show notes. We've got iftf.org, which is the organization that you're a part of. Um, We've got Navigating the Age of Chaos, link over to Amazon. We've also got the third edition of Leaders Make the Future over in the show notes, so you can link there over. The resources just go on and on. The New Leadership Literacies, I've told you before, Work Positive Community is one of the most formative books that I've ever read, and certainly has shaped the work that I'm doing today. Today, literally, as we record this, it shaped
Mm.
that work.
Thank you.
What's one thing that we in the Work Positive community can do? This is our dot challenge, right? Do one thing. What's one thing we can do today, knowing that we're in a Bonnie world, right? What's one thing we can do today to create the kind of positive work culture that brings hope and optimism to our people?
Yeah, one practical thing that I've just started doing when I was writing the Bonnie book with Jemay and Angela, one thing I've been doing that I've had a big positive impact is keeping a daily gratitude journal.
Ah,
And it's easy to do. I just
yeah,
got a little moleskin journal. I've got hundreds of them around my study.
I love it.
I've got one that just says gratitude journal. And
Mm,
every day I write down 1 to 3 things that I'm grateful for.
mm,
And it's amazing how that one thing has a positive impact. And writing the Bonnie book, Navigating the Age of Chaos, was one of the hardest books I've ever written. And it was, it's depressing. It's scary. This is
yeah,
a frightening forecast.
it
I didn't
is.
sleep as well.
Mm,
It was really hard to stay healthy writing that book. Um,
yeah,
Developing the positive Bonnie helped a lot.
mm,
And I've tried to build that now into the way I think about things. But
mm.
my one thing would be a gratitude journal. I think those are very powerful.
I love it. I do that every night before I go to sleep, and I find
Good
that
for you.
so much better. I've probably done that for over a decade, maybe as many as 15 years now.
Yeah,
I
good
just
for
write
you.
down three positive experiences from that day. Also, I like to start meetings with
Hmm.
what's one thing you're grateful for today? And it can be about
Yeah.
work or it can be about something
Yep.
personal. My family and I had a great weekend out on the lake or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting idea and a good idea. What we often do with meetings is what is one signal, a daily experience that you see that hints at where the future is going. So it's kind of could
Mhm.
be something your kids did or
Yeah.
you kind of saw somewhere or just a kind of hint of a signal of the future that's starting to happen. Those are fun to share.
Mm.
I do. My publisher, I've got one of the best editors in the world at Barrett Kohler, Steve Persanti, and
Uh-huh.
he starts every meeting with just a moment of silence, just
Mm.
to kind of, and it's not necessarily prayer,
Mhm.
but it's more just to kind of take stock of where you are as you come into the
Mhm.
meeting.
Mhm. One of my future books is about mental health, and to that point, what if we had a company-wide moment of silence,
Nice.
right, to begin our days? Not necessarily a prayer, but just to kind of center, calm your
Just to
thoughts.
center, yeah.
Yeah, just kind of get inside. And that's a great time to name some things you're grateful for as well in that
It
moment,
is.
right?
You can think about that. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. For me, it usually goes back to my 6-year-old and 8-month-old granddaughters.
Nice. Nice.
That's a
Yeah,
nice antidote to a bunny world.
it
Bob,
is.
thank you so much for being you, for the
Thank you.
massive influence that you've had on me. I'll never be able to thank you enough for that. So you
Thank
will
you.
show up tonight, my friend, in my
Oh, well,
gratitude
thank you.
diary. You will.
Thank you.
And the work positive community is better for you. Thanks for sharing your time and your wisdom with us today.
You're welcome.
I'm so grateful you joined our conversation about creating positive work cultures that grow people and profits. Connect with me directly on LinkedIn today. Just search for Dr. Joey Fawcett, or you can click the link in your show notes. When you send your connection request, mention you're a Work Positive Podcast listener because I want to give you a free digital copy of my Work Positive Team Edition book. It's a $19.95 value, but I want to share it with you free because it contains practical strategies that I personally use with clients to transform toxic work environments into thriving cultures. We explore in that book how to create a positive work culture, and we do so again in every episode of this podcast. Our LinkedIn connection allows you and me to directly talk about your specific challenges, so feel free to send me a message on LinkedIn. I personally read and respond to all those messages because I genuinely care about your work positive success. So go to LinkedIn and let's connect. Remember to mention you're a podcast listener to receive your free Work Positive Team Edition book. I look forward to seeing you on our next episode of the Work Positive Podcast.